Name of the story: Voices on the Baby Monitor. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Emma and Mark had just settled into bed after a long day, the kind of day that left you with no energy to spare. It was only a few hours after midnight, but sleep had come easily to them both. Their baby, Ava, had been asleep for hours in the nursery down the hall. The room had been painted soft yellow, decorated with plush toys and a crib lined with pastel-colored blankets. The baby monitor sat on the bedside table, its small red light blinking steadily, a quiet reassurance that their daughter was safe and sound. But that night, the peaceful silence didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., Emma stirred in her sleep, a strange feeling pulling her from the comfort of her slumber. She opened her eyes and glanced at the monitor. The red light was still blinking. Ava's room seemed silent. But as Emma blinked again, she realized something was off. The static from the monitor had changed. It was no longer just the usual hiss of background noise, but something more. Something she couldn't quite place. The faint crackling intensified, then softened again. She shifted in bed, her mind foggy with sleep. Her hand reached out to adjust the dial on the monitor, but before she could, a voice broke through the static. It was faint at first, a whisper too soft to make out. She froze, her hand hovering over the device. Her heart began to race. Mommy." The voice was unmistakable. It was Ava's voice, but Ava was sound asleep in her crib just down the hall. Emma's blood ran cold as she listened intently. The voice sounded distant. Hollow. "Mommy, where are you?" Mark shifted beside her, mumbling something in his sleep, but Emma was too fixated on the monitor to notice. The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Mommy, help me." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She sat up quickly, now fully awake, her mind racing. She glanced toward the door leading to the nursery, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to check on Ava, but as she reached for the door handle, the voice came once more. It wasn't Ava's voice this time. It was something darker, something colder. "You shouldn't have come back." Emma froze, the blood draining from her face. The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It wasn't human. It was something else. Her eyes darted back to the baby monitor. The red light flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw something moving on the screen. Her breath quickened. She grabbed Mark's arm, shaking him gently. Mark, wake up," she whispered urgently. He groggily stirred, blinking in confusion as his eyes met hers. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Listen," Emma whispered, pointing to the monitor. The voice on the baby monitor came again, now more insistent, more ominous. "She's here. She's waiting." Mark's eyes widened, now fully awake, as he sat up in bed. The room was still and eerily silent except for the voice echoing from the monitor. "Emma, what is that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling with the realization that something was wrong. "I don't know," Emma whispered, her eyes glued to the monitor. "Ava's in her room." "I know she is." But as the words left her mouth, the monitor crackled again, and the voice came once more chilling than ever. "Come play with me." The voice was unmistakably that of a child. It was almost too perfect, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "We need to check on her," Mark said, his voice sharp now with urgency. "We need to make sure she's okay." Emma nodded, already moving toward the door. Mark was right. They couldn't just sit there. They had to make sure Ava was safe. The strange voice, if it even was Ava, had unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. They hurried down the hallway, the creaking floorboards beneath their feet amplifying the tension in the air. When they reached Ava's nursery door, Emma paused, taking a deep breath. She turned the handle slowly, pushing the door open just a crack. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a night light. The crib sat empty, the blankets slightly disheveled. Ava was nowhere to be seen. Her heart stopped for a beat. "Ava!" Emma called, her voice trembling. Mark stepped into the room, his face pale. "She's not here. Where could she be?" Emma's mind raced as she backed away from the crib. The voice on the monitor had come from here, from this room. She could still hear it in her head, that haunting whisper. "Come play with me." Her pulse quickened as she scanned the room, her eyes darting from the empty crib to the closet. It was open just a crack, the faintest sliver of darkness beyond it. "Mark, check the closet," Emma whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Mark walked toward the closet slowly, his every step echoing in the silence. He reached for the door and pulled it open with one swift motion. Nothing. No Ava. No movement. Just empty space. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling. That feeling of being watched. She turned her gaze back toward the crib, her heart hammering in her chest. And that's when she saw it. At the foot of the crib, barely visible in the corner, was a shadow. A small figure, hunched and hungrily watching them. It wasn't Ava. It wasn't human. Emma's scream caught in her throat as she gripped Mark's arm, pulling him back toward the door. The shadow didn't move, but its presence filled the room, thick and oppressive. Its shape was indistinct, more like a smear of darkness than a figure, but the sense of malevolence radiating from it was unmistakable. "Do you see that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. Mark nodded, his face pale. He didn't speak, but his grip tightened on Emma's hand. The shadow shifted slightly, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a chill down her spine. Its form began to solidify, stretching upward, growing taller and more defined. Emma could now make out faint features, eyes sunken and gleaming, a gaping mouth that seemed to grin far too wide. The baby monitor crackled to life again, the static filling the room like a swarm of insects. And then that voice returned. "She's not far. Come closer." Emma shook her head violently, pulling Mark back toward the hallway. "We need to leave," she whispered. "No." "But Ava," Mark began, his voice desperate. "She's not here," Emma interrupted, her voice cracking. "We have to find her, but not here." "Not with that." They backed out of the room slowly, their eyes never leaving the shadowy figure. As they reached the doorway, the figure moved, its head tilting, as if watching them leave. Emma's stomach churned as the monitor in her hand erupted with more static, followed by distorted laughter. The nursery door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the house. Emma let out a sharp gasp, clutching the monitor tightly. The red light blinked erratically now, as though reflecting the chaos inside. "What's happening, Emma?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know," Emma admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "But we need to find Ava. She has to be here somewhere." Mark nodded, his jaw tight, and they hurried down the hallway, checking every room in the house. The living room was empty, the kitchen untouched. The bathroom, the closets, nothing. Ava had disappeared. The baby monitor remained eerily active, the static shifting and warping. Occasionally, they caught snippets of the same chilling voice, repeating phrases that made Emma's skin crawl. "She's here. She's waiting. Come play." The voice was playful yet sinister, a mockery of a child's innocence. Emma's hands trembled as she held the device. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of something unseen. Mark was rifling through the hall closet when a new sound emerged from the monitor. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Emma brought the monitor closer to her ear, straining to identify the noise. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. until it was joined by a muffled whimper. Her heart stopped. "Mark, that's Ava. I hear her." Mark turned quickly, his face a mix of hope and dread. Where? Where is she?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She focused on the sound, trying to pinpoint its source. The tapping wasn't random. It had a rhythm, like tiny fists beating against a surface. And the whimpering, it was Ava's voice, unmistakable, filled with fear. She's somewhere small," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Enclosed. Like she's trapped." Mark's face darkened as he processed her words. "The basement," he said suddenly. "We didn't check the basement." Emma's stomach sank. The basement was the one place in the house she avoided whenever possible. It was damp, unfinished, and filled with shadows that seemed to linger too long. But if Ava was down there... They moved quickly to the basement door, Mark leading the way. He flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb had burned out. "Of course," Mark muttered, his voice tight with frustration. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness as they descended the creaking wooden stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the musty smell of damp earth filling their noses. Emma clutched the monitor tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping and whimpering were louder now, echoing faintly in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark swept the flashlight around the room. Old boxes and discarded furniture cast eerie shadows against the concrete walls. The sound seemed to come from the far corner, where an old, rusted storage cabinet stood. Emma pointed toward it, her voice barely above a whisper. "There. She's in there." Mark hesitated for only a moment before moving toward the cabinet. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he expected the shadows around him to come alive at any moment. Emma stayed close behind, the baby monitor still clutched in her hands. As Mark reached the cabinet, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a weight. Mark reached out, gripping the cabinet door handle. He hesitated, glancing back at Emma. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He pulled the door open, and the metallic groan of its hinges echoed through the basement. Inside was a tangle of cobwebs, dust-coated shelves, and a series of discolored boxes. At first glance, it seemed utterly empty, devoid of anything that might explain the noise or Ava's disappearance. "Mark," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She kept her gaze fixed on the shadows behind him, half expecting something to leap from the darkness. Mark reached inside the cabinet, pushing aside the boxes one by one. The flashlight beam wavered as his hand trembled. At the back of the cabinet, just beyond reach, something gleamed faintly, a small object catching the light. "What's that?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Mark stretched his arm further, his fingertips brushing against the object. With a grunt, he pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a tiny silver bracelet, engraved with Ava's initials, H. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's hers. Mark, she's been here." Mark's brow furrowed as he turned the bracelet over in his hands. "But how? Why would it be back here?" Before Emma could respond, the baby monitor crackled again. The static was sharp and grating, and then Ava's voice came through, clear and desperate. "Mommy, Daddy, help me." Emma's knees buckled, and she clutched Mark's arm for support. Ava, we're here," she shouted into the monitor, as if the device could transmit her voice in return. "Where are you, baby? Tell us where you are." The only reply was a low, guttural laugh that sent a chill straight through Emma's spine. Mark dropped the bracelet and grabbed the monitor, his face a mixture of fear and anger. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The laughter faded, replaced by a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She's waiting. Come find her." Emma's hands trembled as she pointed toward the back wall of the basement. "It's coming from there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated, but the determination in Emma's eyes pushed him forward. They approached the wall together, the flashlight beam dancing across the damp, uneven surface. At first glance, it was just an ordinary wall, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. Mark ran his hand along the surface, his fingers catching on a seam that shouldn't have been there. "There's a gap," he said, his voice tight. "It's like a hidden door." Emma's breath hitched as Mark pressed against the wall. The seam gave way with a faint click, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. The air that wafted out was icy and stale, carrying with it a smell that made Emma gag. Decay and damp earth, mingled with something metallic. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom, but it was enough to show a set of steep, uneven stairs descending into the unknown. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head. "Mark, we can't." "We have to," Mark said firmly, though his voice quivered. "If Ava's down there." Emma swallowed hard, her fear warring with the primal instinct to protect her child. Finally, she nodded, clutching the monitor like a lifeline. Together, they stepped into the passage, the sound of their breathing loud in the suffocating silence. The stairs creaked under their weight, and each step seemed to echo endlessly, as if the space around them stretched on forever. The walls were rough and cold, pressing close on either side. Emma's heart pounded as the static on the monitor grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers and Ava's cries. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a cavernous space that didn't belong beneath their home. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into darkness, and the floor was covered in a strange, uneven texture, like packed earth mixed with something softer. The flashlight beam revealed strange markings on the walls, symbols that seemed to twist and shift when Emma tried to focus on them. In the center of the room was a crude altar, fashioned from jagged stones and stained with something dark and sticky. And there, sitting on the altar, was Ava. Her small figure was hunched over, her face buried in her knees. Her long, dark hair hung limply around her, and she was rocking back and forth, whispering something Emma couldn't hear. "Ava!" Emma cried, rushing forward. But as she neared the altar, Ava's head snapped up, and Emma froze. Ava's eyes were wide and unseeing, her pupils blown out into dark voids. Her lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was deeper, layered, and filled with malice. "Mommy," it said, a twisted smile spreading across her face. "You found me." Emma's legs buckled, and she stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark grabbed her arm, steadying her, his own face as pale as chalk. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he aimed the beam directly at Ava. The light wavered as his hand trembled. "Ava, honey, it's okay. We're here to take you home," he said, his voice cracking. Ava, or whatever was in her, laughed, a sound that echoed and warped in the cavernous space. "Home," the voice taunted. "She doesn't want to go home. She belongs to us now." Emma's fear turned to anger, fueled by the primal need to protect her child. "You don't own her," she shouted, stepping forward. "Give her back to us." The entity tilted Ava's head, studying Emma with an unnatural stillness. Then Ava's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. "Do you even know what you've brought her into?" it hissed. "You opened the door. You let us in." Mark's hand shot to Emma's arm again, holding her back. "Don't engage it," he whispered urgently. "We need to figure out how to get her out of this." Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might help. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faintly in the light, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. She noticed something on the altar next to Ava, a small, jagged knife, the blade stained with dried blood. "That's part of it," she whispered, pointing. "Whatever's happening here, that's connected." Mark nodded, his jaw set. "Stay back," he said. He moved cautiously toward the altar, his every step crunching against the uneven ground. The flashlight beam flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The entity watched him with unsettling calm, Ava's body unnervingly still except for the slight tilt of her head. "Closer," it whispered, its voice almost playful. "Come see your daughter up close." Mark ignored it, focusing on the knife. When he was within reach, he lunged, grabbing the hilt and yanking it off the altar. As soon as his hand made contact, Ava let out a piercing scream. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the space and rattling Mark to his core. Emma covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Mark," she shouted. "What's happening?" The symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. The ground beneath them began to shift, as if something was moving just below the surface. A guttural roar came from all around them, filling the space with a sense of overwhelming dread. "You can't stop this," the entity said through Ava, its voice rising above the chaos. "She is ours. You all are." Mark gritted his teeth, gripping the knife tightly. "No, she's not," he shouted. He turned to Emma, desperation in his eyes. "We have to break whatever this is. The symbols, try to destroy them." Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She picked up a piece of jagged stone from the ground and ran to the nearest wall. With all her strength, she began chipping away at the glowing markings. The moment the first symbol cracked, the light dimmed slightly, and the roar shifted to an agonized howl. "It's working," she shouted. "Mark, keep it distracted." Mark turned back to Ava, his heart aching as he saw her small, fragile body being used as a puppet. "Ava, if you can hear me, I need you to fight," he said, his voice shaking. "You're stronger than this thing. We're here, and we're not leaving without you." For a brief moment, Ava's eyes flickered, her pupils shrinking back to something human. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak and frightened. But the entity quickly regained control, and Ava's face twisted into a snarl. "Enough!" it roared, lunging toward Mark. It moved with an unnatural speed, its small frame propelled by something far more powerful. Mark barely managed to dodge, falling to the ground and clutching the knife. Emma continued her frantic work, destroying one symbol after another. Each time she broke one, the room seemed to lose a bit of its malevolent energy. The shadows grew thinner, the air less oppressive, but the ground beneath them was growing more unstable, cracks forming and spreading outward. "We're running out of time," Emma shouted. "Mark, we need to end this now." Mark scrambled to his feet, gripping the knife like a lifeline. He looked at the altar, then back at Ava. The answer was there, but it was one he didn't want to face. "Mark," Emma said, her voice breaking, "whatever you're thinking, just do it." Mark nodded, his throat tight. He approached Ava again, the knife trembling in his hand. "I'm sorry, baby," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "But I'll bring you back. I promise." He raised the knife, aiming for the altar itself. With a roar of determination, he plunged the blade into the center of the stone. The room erupted into chaos, a blinding light, a deafening scream, and then silence. When the light faded, Ava lay on the ground, unconscious but breathing. The symbols were gone, the room dark and quiet. Emma rushed to her daughter, pulling her into her arms and sobbing with relief. Mark collapsed to his knees, the knife slipping from his hand. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's finally over." Or so they thought. Mark and Emma carried Ava out of the crypt-like room, their steps slow and cautious. The oppressive weight of the air had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt just as unsettling. The house above them, now devoid of the strange whispers and creaks, seemed almost too quiet. Ava stirred in Emma's arms, her eyelids fluttering open. "Mommy," she mumbled, her voice small and groggy. Emma held her tighter, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're going home now." Mark led the way up the narrow staircase, his flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. As they reached the basement, he paused, scanning the space. The walls no longer bore the strange markings, and the air felt less oppressive, but the memory of what had transpired lingered like a dark shadow. They emerged into the main part of the house, its familiar surroundings offering a fleeting sense of comfort. Emma placed Ava on the couch, wrapping her in a blanket. She smoothed her daughter's hair, her hands trembling. "You're safe now," she whispered, more to herself than to Ava. Mark paced the room, his mind racing. "We need to leave," he said abruptly. "I don't know what else might be tied to this place, but I'm not waiting to find out." Emma nodded, her agreement immediate. "Let's pack whatever we can and get out of here." As they gathered their essentials, a faint knock echoed through the house. Both froze, exchanging a look of dread. Mark grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel, his makeshift weapon clutched tightly in his hand. He moved toward the front door, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm but edged with fear. No answer. Another knock followed, softer this time, almost hesitant. Emma stood by Ava, her eyes fixed on the door. "Mark, don't open it," she whispered. "What if it's one of them?" Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. But the silence stretched on, and the tension became unbearable. Slowly, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. Nothing. The porch was empty, the street beyond bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. A cold breeze drifted past, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. "Is someone out there?" Mark stepped onto the porch, peering into the darkness. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. He lingered for a moment longer before retreating back inside and locking the door. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "Let's hurry." They worked quickly, packing essentials and loading them into the car. Ava remained quiet, her eyes wide and distant. She clutched her favorite stuffed animal tightly, her small hands trembling. When they were finally ready, Mark took one last look at the house. He felt no sadness leaving it behind, only relief. As they drove away, the tension in his chest began to ease, though he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still watching them. The drive was silent, the family too exhausted and shaken to speak. Emma kept glancing at Ava in the back seat, her heart breaking at the haunted look in her daughter's eyes. As they reached the outskirts of town, Ava suddenly sat up straighter. "Mommy," she said, her voice trembling. Emma turned to her, her heart leaping. "What is it, baby?" Ava's eyes filled with tears. "He's still here." Emma's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Who's still here?" Ava pointed to the empty seat beside her, her hand trembling. "The man from the basement. He's sitting right there." Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the deserted road. He turned, his eyes darting to the seat Ava had indicated. It was empty, at least to them. "Ava, there's no one there," Emma said, her voice shaking. "It's okay. You're safe now." Ava shook her head, her grip on her stuffed animal tightening. "He's smiling," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And he says we can't leave." A chill ran down Mark and Emma's spines. The air in the car seemed to grow colder, the windows fogging slightly. Mark started the car again, his hands shaking. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what." As they drove, the headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. Emma glanced in the rearview mirror, her breath catching as she saw something. A faint outline, a shadowy figure sitting beside Ava. When she blinked, it was gone. But deep down, she knew. They had left the house, but something had followed them. Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he pressed the gas pedal harder. The car sped down the deserted road, the trees on either side swaying in the wind like silent sentinels. The oppressive silence inside the vehicle was broken only by Ava's soft sniffles and the hum of the engine. Emma kept glancing at her daughter, her mind racing with silent prayers that they could escape whatever horror had latched onto them. "Do you think it's really still with us?" Emma finally whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't dare look behind her. Mark didn't answer immediately. His jaw clenched, his focus on the road. "I don't know," he said at last. "But we can't stop. Not until we're far away." Emma reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she tried to call her sister. The screen remained blank, refusing to light up. "No signal," she muttered, her frustration and fear mounting. "Of course," Mark muttered, his tone bitter. "Nothing ever works when you need it to." Ava suddenly gasped, her small hands clutching at her stuffed animal. "Mommy, he's mad," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He doesn't want us to go." Emma twisted in her seat, her heart racing. "Sweetheart, listen to me. You're safe. He can't hurt you. We're going far away, okay?" Ava shook her head, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "He's not gone. She froze, her gaze fixed on something behind Mark. Emma's stomach dropped. "What is it, Ava? What do you see?" Before Ava could answer, the car jerked violently to the left. Mark struggled to regain control, his hands fighting against the steering wheel as the tires screeched against the asphalt. The headlights flickered, the engine sputtering before roaring back to life. "What the hell was that?" Mark shouted, his voice laced with panic. "I don't know," Emma cried. She turned her head sharply, her eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. "Did we hit something?" "No," Mark said through gritted teeth. The road was clear. "It's like something pulled us." Emma's breath caught as a low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere outside the car. It was faint but unmistakable. She turned to Ava, who was now curled up in her seat, her face buried in her knees. The growl grew louder, and then the car suddenly went silent. The engine cut out, the headlights dimmed, and they were plunged into darkness. Mark frantically turned the key in the ignition, but it wouldn't start. Come on," he muttered, his voice breaking. Emma reached for Ava, pulling her close. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence outside the car was deafening. Then, there was a soft tapping on the driver's side window. Tap, tap, tap. Mark froze, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly it seemed he might snap it in half. The tapping came again, louder this time. Emma's breath hitched as she dared to glance at the window. Nothing was there, just the inky blackness of the night. And then, the tapping shifted to her window. "Drive, Mark," Emma hissed, her voice barely a whisper. "Start the car now." "I'm trying." Mark barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. A shadow passed in front of the windshield, blocking what faint light the moon provided. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured, but they could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating. Emma clutched Ava tighter, shielding her as best she could. "Mark!" she screamed. The engine roared to life, and Mark slammed his foot on the gas. The car shot forward, the shadow vanishing as they sped down the road. Emma dared to look back, but the rearview mirror reflected only darkness. For a moment, they thought they were safe. The car hummed steadily, the road stretching endlessly before them. But then Ava spoke, her voice so soft they almost didn't hear her. "He's in the car now," she said, her voice hollow. Emma and Mark turned slowly, their hearts pounding. In the dim light from the dashboard, a figure sat in the back seat beside Ava. Its face was pale and distorted, its eyes gleaming with malice. The car swerved as Mark let out a scream. Emma reached for Ava, but the figure moved faster, its cold, claw-like hand gripping Emma's wrist. The temperature in the car plummeted, frost creeping across the windows. "You can't leave," the figure rasped, its voice a low, guttural growl. "This is my home." Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. He and Emma scrambled out, pulling Ava with them. The figure remained inside, its glowing eyes following their every move as they stumbled onto the road. The car door slammed shut on its own, and the headlights flared one last time before the vehicle disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Emma held Ava close, tears streaming down her face as she looked around. They were alone on the road, the car and the figure both gone. But the oppressive feeling lingered, a chilling reminder that they were far from safe. The night was unnaturally quiet, the silence punctuated only by the rustle of leaves and their shallow, panicked breaths. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, illuminated faintly by the silver glow of the moon. Mark gripped Emma's arm, his knuckles white. "We have to move," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We can't stay here." "But where?" Emma's voice trembled, clutching Ava, who buried her face into her mother's chest. "We don't even know where we are." Mark glanced down the road, his heart pounding. Every shadow seemed alive, every whisper of wind a warning. "There's got to be something ahead," he said, trying to sound confident though his insides churned with fear. "We just need to keep walking." Emma hesitated, her instincts screaming to stay put. But the thought of staying on this road any longer was unbearable. She nodded, gripping Ava tightly. They began walking, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. For a time, it felt like they were making progress. The crunch of gravel beneath their feet was almost comforting, a tangible connection to reality. But soon, Emma noticed something strange. The road didn't seem to change. The trees on either side were identical, the curve of the road repetitive. She glanced at Mark, whose jaw was set in grim determination, and then back at Ava, who was unusually quiet. "Mark," she said cautiously, "do you feel like we're going in circles?" He didn't answer at first, but the tightening of his grip on her arm was answer enough. Finally, he stopped, turning to face her. "I think," he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I think this place isn't normal. We've been walking for miles, but we're not getting anywhere." Ava looked up at them then, her face pale and solemn. "He's making it like this," she said softly. "He doesn't want us to leave." Emma knelt down, her hands trembling as she smoothed Ava's hair. "Sweetheart, who is he? Can you tell us?" Ava hesitated, glancing over her shoulder into the shadows. "The man from the monitor," she whispered. "He's angry because we took me away." Emma's heart sank, a chill running down her spine. "What do you mean, Ava? Took you away from what?" Ava didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the darkness behind them. Emma followed her eyes, her stomach twisting into knots. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a ripple in the shadows, like someone stepping closer. Mark pulled them both forward. "We keep moving. Standing here isn't helping." They pressed on, their pace quickening. The road remained unchanged, a haunting loop of monotony. Emma's legs ached, and Ava grew heavier in her arms. Mark stayed ahead, his focus unyielding. Then, a faint light appeared in the distance. Emma's heart leapt. "Mark, look," she cried. He turned, his face a mix of relief and caution. Finally, he muttered, "Let's go." As they approached, the light resolved into the outline of a small building, a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Open 24 hours, it proclaimed, though the letters blinked in and out, making the message feel more ominous than welcoming. Inside, the diner seemed frozen in time. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter stretched across the room, but there was no one in sight. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of grease and something metallic. Mark pushed open the door, and the bell above it jingled, the sound unnervingly loud. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing in the empty space. No response. Emma hesitated in the doorway, clutching Ava tightly. "Mark, I don't think we should." "We don't have a choice," he interrupted, his voice firm. "We need to rest. We need to think." Reluctantly, Emma followed him inside. She set Ava down in a booth, glancing around uneasily. The place was too quiet, too still, as if it had been waiting for them. Mark moved behind the counter, searching for anything useful. "There's water," he said, holding up a bottle. "And snacks." He grabbed a few packets of crackers and brought them to the table. As they ate, the oppressive silence seemed to grow louder, pressing in on them. Ava nibbled on a cracker, her eyes darting to the window. "He's watching," she whispered. Emma froze. "Ava, what do you mean?" Ava pointed to the glass, her hand trembling. Mark and Emma turned slowly. Outside, in the pale moonlight, the shadow of a figure stood still, just beyond the reach of the neon glow. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form indistinct but menacing. Mark stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Stay here," he ordered, heading for the door. "Mark, no!" Emma cried, grabbing his arm. "You don't know what's out there." "I'm not letting it trap us again," he said, his voice shaking with determination. "If we stay here, we'll never leave." Before Emma could stop him, he pushed the door open and stepped outside. The figure didn't move, its presence as still and oppressive as a nightmare. Emma clutched Ava, her heart pounding as she watched Mark approach the figure. Then, just as he reached out, the shadow seemed to dissolve, melting into the night. Mark staggered back, his face pale. "It's gone," he said, turning to Emma. But as he stepped forward, the neon sign flickered violently, casting the diner in darkness. And then Ava whispered, "No, Daddy. He's inside now." The diner plunged into suffocating darkness, the only sound the erratic hum of the flickering neon sign outside. Emma clutched Ava tightly, her breath caught in her throat. Mark froze by the door, his eyes darting around the blackened room. "Ava," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean he's inside?" Ava didn't respond. Her small frame was rigid, her gaze fixed on something in the shadowy corner of the diner. Emma followed her line of sight, squinting to see through the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the dull shapes of chairs and tables. But then, a faint movement caught her eye. It wasn't quite human the way it moved. The shadow slipped and stretched unnaturally, flowing like ink across the floor. Emma's grip on Ava tightened, her nails digging into the child's arm as she fought to stifle a scream. "Mark," she hissed, her voice barely audible. "I see it," he whispered back, stepping cautiously toward the booth. His body was tense, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if it could somehow anchor him to safety. "Emma, don't move. Just stay quiet." The shadow seemed to pulse, its edges flickering and wavering like smoke. As it loomed closer, it began to take on a more defined shape. A tall, angular figure with impossibly long limbs and hollow, glowing eyes that radiated a faint, sickly yellow. It didn't walk, it glided, its form barely touching the ground. Emma's heart raced as the figure stopped just a few feet away from their booth. It tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed directly on Ava. "No," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She shielded Ava with her body, her instincts overpowering her terror. "Stay away from her." The figure didn't react, but its presence seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Ava, however, didn't look afraid. Instead, she sat up straighter, her wide eyes locking onto the figure's glowing ones. "You shouldn't be here," Ava said, her voice eerily calm. The figure twitched, its head tilting further to the side. A low, guttural sound filled the room, not quite a growl, not quite a voice. It was like the rumble of distant thunder, layered with an otherworldly resonance. Mark reached for Emma's hand, his fingers trembling. "We have to leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How?" Emma's voice broke as tears streamed down her face. "It's blocking the door." Ava turned to them, her face strangely serene. "He doesn't want us to leave. He wants me to come back." Emma shook her head violently. No, you're not going anywhere." The shadow figure shifted, its movements jerky and unnatural. It began to extend one of its limbs, a long, skeletal arm reaching toward Ava. Emma cried out, pulling Ava closer, but the child didn't flinch. "You can't have her," Emma screamed. "She's ours." The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. The low, guttural sound grew louder, vibrating through the air. It felt like the diner itself was trembling, the walls shuddering and the floor quaking beneath them. Mark grabbed a chair and hurled it at the figure. It passed through harmlessly, the shadow rippling as if disturbed by a breeze. But the distraction was enough. Emma stood, pulling Ava to her feet. "Run!" Mark shouted. They bolted for the door, Emma clutching Ava and Mark right behind them. The shadow figure screeched, the sound high-pitched and piercing, sending waves of pain through their heads. But they didn't stop. Mark threw his weight against the door, and it burst open. They stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. The road stretched ahead of them, empty and bathed in pale moonlight. Behind them, the diner's neon sign flickered one last time before plunging into total darkness. "Keep going," Mark urged, his voice raw. "Don't look back." They ran, their footsteps pounding against the asphalt. The air felt heavier with each step, the shadows around them closing in. Emma dared a glance over her shoulder and froze. The shadow figure was following them, its form gliding effortlessly along the road. It didn't seem to be in any hurry, but its glowing eyes were locked on Ava. "Faster!" Emma shouted, panic surging through her. But the road ahead didn't change. No matter how far they ran, the diner still loomed in the distance behind them, its darkened windows watching like empty eyes. It was as if they were trapped in a loop, unable to escape the shadow's reach. Mark stumbled, his knees buckling. Emma grabbed his arm, pulling him up. "We can't stop," she cried. "I know," he gasped, his face pale. "But what do we do? We can't outrun it forever." Ava tugged at Emma's sleeve, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "I know how to make it stop." Emma looked down at her, her chest tightening. "What are you talking about, Ava?" The little girl's eyes brimmed with tears, but her expression was resolute. "He wants me. If I go to him, he'll let you go." "No." Emma's voice cracked. "I won't let that happen." "You don't have to," Mark said, his voice trembling but firm. "We'll find another way." But Ava shook her head, stepping out of Emma's grasp. "There isn't another way. He told me. In the monitor." The shadow figure drew closer, its hulking form looming over them like a living nightmare. Emma and Mark exchanged a desperate glance, their hearts breaking as they realized they were out of time. Emma grabbed Ava's arm, her voice trembling as she begged, "No, Ava. Don't listen to him. We can fight this. We can." "Mom," Ava interrupted softly, her voice carrying a maturity far beyond her years. "It's the only way. He doesn't want you or Dad. He only wants me." "No!" Emma's scream was raw, but Ava gently pulled free from her grasp and stepped forward. The shadow figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as if waiting, watching her every movement. Mark staggered to his feet, his voice a desperate plea. "Ava, don't do this. You don't have to. I love you," Ava said, her voice steady. She turned back to face her parents, her expression filled with sorrow and determination. "But he's not going to stop. I'll make sure you're safe." Before Emma or Mark could stop her, Ava stepped closer to the shadow figure. It seemed to swell in size, the darkness around it pulsating with an eerie rhythm. As Ava approached, the figure extended its skeletal arm, the elongated fingers reaching toward her. Emma screamed and lunged forward, but Mark caught her, holding her back. "We'll lose her if you go near it," he shouted, his own voice breaking. Ava reached the shadow and stood still, staring up at the towering figure. Its glowing eyes softened, dimming slightly as it lowered its hand to touch her shoulder. The moment its fingers made contact, the air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Ava looked back at her parents one last time, her eyes filled with tears. "Goodbye," she whispered. The shadow seemed to envelop her, its form wrapping around her small frame. Emma screamed again, fighting against Mark's grip, but it was too late. Ava and the shadow vanished, dissolving into the night like smoke caught in the wind. The silence that followed was deafening. The road ahead finally changed, stretching out into an empty, moonlit path. The diner was gone, leaving nothing but an open stretch of desolate asphalt. Emma collapsed to the ground, her sobs echoing in the still night. Mark knelt beside her, his own tears streaming down his face as he wrapped his arms around her. They stayed there, clutching each other, their hearts shattered. Months passed, but Emma and Mark never truly recovered. The house was quieter without Ava's laughter, the empty space in their lives a constant reminder of what they had lost. But sometimes, late at night, Emma would hear the faint crackle of the baby monitor they had left untouched in Ava's room. And in the static, she swore she could hear Ava's voice, whispering softly, "I'm safe. Don't worry about me." The monitor would go silent after that, leaving Emma staring into the darkness, tears streaming down her face as she clung to the faint hope that somehow, somewhere, Ava was still out there, watching over them. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow wasn't done with them yet. The nights grew colder, and the house seemed to hold its breath as though waiting. Emma and Mark went through the motions of life, their days a blur of work and the unbearable emptiness of their home. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow in the corner of their eyes, brought with it the haunting reminder of what had happened. Emma became obsessed with the baby monitor. She kept it on her bedside table, the soft hum of static a constant presence in their bedroom. Mark had tried to convince her to let it go, to pack it away with the rest of Ava's things, but she refused. "Her voice is there, Mark," she insisted one evening, her hands trembling as she adjusted the monitor's frequency. "I can hear her. She's reaching out." Mark didn't argue. He knew better than to fight the hope that Emma clung to, fragile as it was. But he couldn't bring himself to believe it. Every night, he stared at the ceiling, wondering if the shadow had truly taken Ava, or if it had left her trapped somewhere beyond their reach. One night, as Emma lay in bed with the monitor cradled in her hands, the static shifted. It wasn't the faint crackle of before, but something deeper, more guttural. The sound rose and fell like a distorted voice, and Emma froze, her heart pounding. "Mark," she whispered harshly, shaking him awake. "Listen." Mark sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes as he leaned closer to the monitor. The sound grew louder, a garbled series of words that neither of them could make out. Then, as they strained to understand, a clear voice broke through the static. "Mom, Dad," Emma gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Ava, Ava, is that you?" The voice wavered, fragile and distant. "It's dark here. I'm scared." Emma sobbed, clutching the monitor tighter. "We're coming for you. Just tell us where you are, sweetheart." There was a long pause. Then Ava's voice returned, quieter, almost a whisper. "He's here. He doesn't like that I'm talking to you." The words sent a chill down Mark's spine. He reached out, grabbing Emma's arm. "Turn it off," he said urgently. "Emma, we don't know what this is." "No," Emma cried, pulling away. "This is our daughter, Mark. She needs us." The monitor crackled again, and this time a different voice emerged, deep, resonant, and filled with malice. "You should have stayed silent." The lights in the bedroom flickered violently, the air growing heavy and oppressive. Emma and Mark clung to each other as the shadow they thought they had escaped began to seep into the room, dark tendrils curling along the walls and ceiling. Ava's voice returned, desperate and hurried. "Mom! Dad! Don't let him!" The connection cut off with a sharp crack, and the monitor went dead. The darkness in the room deepened, and the shadow began to take shape once more. Its glowing eyes pierced through the gloom, fixing on them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. Mark grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the door. "We have to get out of here." But the shadow blocked their path, its towering form stretching across the room. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from all around them. "You cannot take her from me," it hissed. Emma and Mark exchanged a terrified glance. They realized then that their battle with the shadow was far from over, and that it wouldn't stop until it claimed them too. The room plunged into a suffocating silence, broken only by the rasping growl of the shadow. Its tendrils stretched closer, brushing against Emma's arm like cold, smoke-filled air. She recoiled, clutching Mark's hand tighter as her breath came in shallow gasps. "We didn't invite you here," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Leave us alone." The shadow's form wavered, its edges flickering as though caught in a strong wind. But its voice remained steady, a deep resonance that vibrated through the very floorboards. "She is mine now," it said. "You should not have listened. You should not have interfered." Emma's tears spilled freely as she stared at the entity, her maternal instinct overriding her terror. "She's our daughter. You can't keep her. She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to the dark," the shadow growled, its glowing eyes narrowing. "And soon, so will you." Mark's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything he could use against the shadow. His eyes landed on the monitor, its once innocuous form now a chilling link to whatever hellish dimension the shadow inhabited. Desperation surged through him, and he lunged for it, yanking the device from Emma's grip. "What are you doing?" she cried, reaching for him. "Don't. We need to sever the connection," he said through gritted teeth. "It's the only way." Before Emma could stop him, Mark hurled the monitor against the wall. The plastic casing shattered, sparks flying as the circuitry inside crumbled. The shadow let out a deafening roar, a sound that shook the walls and made their ears ring. For a moment, the room was still. The shadow seemed to retreat, its tendrils shrinking back into the corners of the room. Emma and Mark stood frozen, their hearts pounding as they dared to hope that the nightmare might be over. But then a low, mocking laugh echoed through the air. The shadow reformed, larger and more menacing than before. "Foolish humans," it sneered. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand." Emma screamed as the shadow lunged toward them, its dark mass enveloping the room. Mark grabbed her, pulling her toward the door with all his strength. They stumbled into the hallway, the oppressive darkness chasing them like a living, breathing entity. "We need to leave the house," Mark shouted. "It's not safe here." Emma nodded, too terrified to argue. They bolted down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the silent house. The shadow pursued them relentlessly, its form twisting and shifting like a living nightmare. They reached the front door, but as Mark fumbled with the lock, the shadow surged forward, wrapping around them in a suffocating embrace. Emma screamed, thrashing against the darkness as icy tendrils gripped her arms and legs. "Let us go!" Mark bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. The shadow's glowing eyes appeared inches from his face, and its voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "You will never escape." In a surge of defiance, Mark reached for the light switch on the wall, flipping it on with trembling fingers. The sudden burst of light flooded the room, piercing through the darkness like a blade. The shadow recoiled with an unearthly shriek, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as Mark knelt beside her, his arms wrapped protectively around her. They sat there in the harsh glow of the overhead light, their bodies trembling as the weight of what had just happened sank in. The house was silent once more, but they both knew it was only a matter of time before the shadow returned. Emma looked up at Mark, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to find her," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We have to bring Ava back." Mark nodded, his jaw set with grim resolve. "We will," he said, "no matter what it takes." The night stretched on, their breaths shallow in the dimly lit hallway as the adrenaline began to fade. Every creak of the house seemed like a threat, every shadow a potential hiding place for the dark entity that had been stalking them. Emma's mind raced, the overwhelming fear mixing with an unrelenting sense of guilt. She had failed her daughter, she had let this darkness into their home, let it get close to Ava. And now, the shadow was more powerful than ever. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get out of the house. We can't do anything while we're stuck here." Emma didn't argue. She knew he was right. The house wasn't safe, not anymore. The thought of leaving their home, the place where they had built a life with their daughter, twisted her stomach, but it was the only option they had. They quickly moved to the front door, Mark's hands shaking as he turned the knob. The lock clicked, but the door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, but it felt as though something was pushing back from the other side. "Let me try," Emma said, her voice steadier now. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, gripping the door handle. With all her might, she threw herself against it, the wood groaning under the pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden snap, the door flung open, the hinges screeching in protest. They both stumbled out into the night air, the cool breeze against their skin feeling almost like a blessing after the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Emma's eyes scanned the street. It was eerily quiet. No one else seemed to be awake at this hour. The entire world felt frozen, like time had stopped while they had been trapped in their own nightmare. "We need to find a place to go," Mark said, his voice urgent. "Somewhere safe." "We can't just leave Ava," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "We have to find her first." Mark shook his head. "We don't know where she is. We don't know how to fight this thing. We have to get help. Maybe there's someone who can help us understand what's going on." But Emma wasn't listening. The fear and love for her daughter were overpowering everything else. Ava was out there, somewhere, lost to them, taken by the shadow. Emma's heart clenched painfully at the thought. "No," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "We need to go back inside. I'm not leaving without her." Mark's expression softened, but he didn't argue. He knew this was a battle Emma had to fight in her own way. And maybe, just maybe, he would help her. The shadow might be too strong, but they had one thing left on their side: hope. Hope that they could find their daughter. Hope that they could beat this thing. Hope that the love they had for each other would be enough. "Let's go," he said finally. Together, they made their way back to the house. As they crossed the threshold, the air felt heavier than before. The silence was suffocating, thick with tension, as though something was waiting just beyond their reach. The lights flickered above them, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Emma's breath hitched, but she forced herself to keep moving, pushing past the fear, past the terror that gripped her chest. "Ava," she called out softly, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the unsettling silence that seemed to echo around them. Mark's hand tightened around hers, and they continued toward the staircase. Every step felt like an eternity, but they finally reached the second floor. The hallway stretched before them, empty and desolate. Emma's pulse quickened as she approached Ava's room, the door standing ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. With a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open. The room was empty, just as it had been when they first left. But there was something different now, an eerie stillness in the air, a heaviness that made her skin crawl. And then, from the corner of the room, a faint whisper. "Ava!" Emma breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The whisper grew louder, clearer, a voice that sounded like her daughter's, but twisted and distorted. "Mom!" Emma spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadow was there, lurking in the corner of the room, its form flickering like a malfunctioning television. It swirled in on itself, the eyes glowing bright and angry. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed. Emma's eyes widened with terror. "Where is she?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Where is Ava?" The shadow's laugh echoed through the room, sending chills down her spine. "She's where she belongs." Before Emma could react, the shadow lunged toward them, its dark mass enveloping the room. Mark grabbed Emma, pulling her back toward the door, but it was too late. The shadow was everywhere, surrounding them, suffocating them. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow began to retreat, its form dissipating into the walls like smoke. Emma and Mark stood frozen, their hearts racing. And then, from the darkness, a voice called out again. "Mom!" Emma gasped. That was Ava's voice. It was coming from inside the walls. With renewed determination, Emma and Mark rushed to the wall, frantically clawing at the wood. The sound of their desperation echoed through the room. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the wall split open, revealing a small, cramped space. Ava lay there, unconscious but alive. "Mom! Dad!" she whimpered, her small body trembling. Emma's heart broke as she scooped her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly. "We're here, baby," she whispered through her tears. "We're here." But the nightmare wasn't over. They still had to face the darkness, the shadow that had been tormenting them. And as Emma looked down at Ava, she knew they would fight with everything they had to keep their family together. The air around them was still, unnaturally so, as if time itself had frozen in place. Emma clutched Ava tightly, her arms trembling as she held her daughter close. Every instinct told her to run, to leave the house and never look back. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the solution. The shadow had followed them, it had waited for them, and it wasn't going to let them go that easily. Mark's eyes scanned the room, his face pale with fear. His gaze flicked to the open space where the shadow had once lingered. It was gone, but the air still felt thick with its presence. Every creak of the house, every sound in the walls made his skin crawl. He didn't trust the silence. He didn't trust the way the house seemed to be holding its breath. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice low and strained. "Now, before it comes back." But Emma shook her head, her eyes fixed on Ava. The child was pale, her skin cold to the touch, and Emma couldn't help but wonder what the shadow had done to her during its time with her. "No," Emma said, her voice firm. "We can't run anymore. We need to end this, once and for all." Mark stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion and concern. "What do you mean? You can't possibly think." "I'm not leaving her," Emma interrupted, her voice breaking. We have to confront it. We have to find a way to destroy it. Mark looked at Ava, his heart in his throat as he saw how fragile she looked, how lost she seemed. He didn't know what to do, how to fight something so dark, so powerful. But he knew one thing for sure, Emma was right. They couldn't run anymore. This was their home, their family, and they had to fight for it. "Okay," Mark said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We'll fight, but we need a plan." Emma nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She glanced down at Ava, who had her arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck. The girl was still trembling, her face pale, but there was a spark in her eyes, something that told Emma her daughter was still with her, still fighting. They needed to find the source. The shadow had to have a weakness, a way to banish it. Emma had no idea how, but she wasn't about to let it take them down. Not after everything they had been through. There was one thing Emma had learned in the last few hours. Whatever the shadow was, it fed off fear. It thrived in the dark, and the more they cowered, the stronger it became. If they were going to fight it, they couldn't show fear. Not now. Not ever. "We need to find where it's coming from," Emma said. "We need to find the heart of it, the source. We can't defeat it until we know where it's hiding." Mark looked around the room, his eyes darting across every shadow, every corner. He didn't know where to start. The house felt like it was watching them, its very walls alive with the evil that had taken root inside it. "The diary," Mark said suddenly, his eyes locking onto the small book that Emma had left on the floor, the one she had found earlier. What if the diary tells us something? Maybe it knows something about this thing. Emma froze. The diary. She had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of everything that had happened since. She had read bits and pieces earlier, but in her panic, she hadn't fully processed what she'd read. "You're right," she said, quickly grabbing the diary from the floor. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, scanning them for any clues, any mention of the shadow. The pages were filled with descriptions of the strange happenings that had plagued the previous tenant, but Emma's eyes were drawn to a page near the back. It was a drawing, hastily scrawled but unmistakable, a dark figure, its form indistinct but unmistakably monstrous, standing tall in the corner of a room. This is it," Emma whispered. "This is the shadow." Mark leaned in, looking at the drawing, his face twisted in confusion and fear. "But how? How do we stop it?" Emma's gaze flicked to the words beneath the drawing. They were written in a shaky, hurried hand. "It feeds on fear. It gets stronger the more you fight it. You must find its source. You must go into the dark and face it. But be warned, once you see it, you cannot look away." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words were clear now, but they held a chilling weight. She looked at Mark, her eyes filled with fear and determination. "We have to go into the basement," Emma said, her voice steady but her heart racing. "That's where it's coming from. That's where it's hiding." Mark didn't question her. He didn't have time to. The basement had always been the source of the house's strange noises, the place they had avoided for as long as they could remember, and now it was their only hope. Together, they stood up, Emma clutching Ava close to her chest. They moved toward the door, the quiet of the house pressing in on them, the shadows watching from every corner. They knew what they had to do. They had no other choice. The stairs to the basement felt colder than they ever had before. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became, the weight of it dragging at their every step. The door to the basement creaked as they opened it, and the darkness within seemed to swallow them whole. Emma's heart pounded as they descended into the darkness, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She could feel the shadow's presence, its weight pressing down on her, growing heavier with every step. She had never felt so alone in her life, so vulnerable. But she wasn't alone. She had Mark. She had Ava, and together they were going to fight no matter the cost. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the air was thick with a cold, damp smell. The basement stretched out before them, its corners shrouded in darkness. But there, at the far end of the room, they saw it. A shadow, larger now, more solid. It was waiting for them, its eyes glowing with malice. "You shouldn't have come," the shadow hissed, its voice a low growl. Emma's breath hitched, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to back down now. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. And with that, they took the first step toward the shadow, toward the darkness, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. The shadow seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as Emma, Mark, and Ava stepped deeper into the basement. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the very house itself was suffocating them. The shadow, once a vague presence, now seemed more defined, a towering figure in the corner of the room, watching them with its glowing eyes. Ava clutched her mother tighter, her small fingers digging into Emma's arm, but Emma refused to show fear. She had to be strong, for her daughter, for her family. Mark's eyes scanned the room, his breath shallow as he looked for any means of defense. But the basement was barren, save for old boxes and dusty furniture covered in sheets. There was no weapon to be found. As they approached the shadow, its form seemed to twist and shift, like liquid dark matter pooling on the floor. It wasn't entirely solid, yet it exuded an overpowering presence that filled the room, suffocating the air with its oppressive weight. "You cannot escape," the shadow whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "I am the darkness that lives within your walls. I am what you hide from. You cannot defeat me." Emma felt a chill crawl down her spine, but she stood tall, clutching Ava even tighter. "We don't need to defeat you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We just need to expose you, to take away the power you've held over us." The shadow let out a low, guttural laugh, its shape rippling as though amused. "You think you can undo what's been done? The fear you've fed me, the darkness you've welcomed into your home, it cannot be undone. You're mine now, all of you." The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Emma could see her breath misting in the air. The shadow seemed to grow larger, taking shape, its form becoming more defined and monstrous. It was no longer just a vague presence. It was a beast made of darkness, its body writhing and twisting as it inched closer. Mark instinctively stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "Stay back," he warned Emma and Ava. But Emma shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "We end this together." The shadow lunged forward, its form flickering like a broken television screen. And just before it reached them, Emma had an idea. The diary. She remembered the final words written in the frantic scrawl, the one she hadn't fully processed until now. "Once you see it, you cannot look away." The words haunted her, and a thought sparked in her mind. "See it, look at it, and it loses its power." "Mark, we have to look at it," she whispered, her voice steady now. "We have to stare at it until it loses its grip on us." Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you sure? You heard what it said. It feeds on fear." "I know," Emma replied, her eyes locked onto the swirling mass of darkness. "But we've been afraid for too long. It's time we stop hiding from it." Mark took a deep breath, nodding. He had no other choice. Together they would face it. The shadow roared, its voice a cacophony of whispers and shrieks, but Emma and Mark didn't look away. They forced their gaze to remain fixed on the creature, feeling its cold, suffocating presence pressing in on them. They couldn't afford to blink, to lose focus. They had to stay strong. The shadow writhed, its form trembling as it fought to maintain its hold over them. It hissed, furious and desperate. The glow from its eyes flickered, dimming. Emma felt a surge of something inside her. Anger, fear, but most of all, a sense of resolve. This was it. This was the moment they would take their power back. Slowly, the shadow began to shrink, its form collapsing inward, as if the very light of their defiance was eating away at it. The temperature in the room began to rise, the suffocating chill lifting. Mark looked over at Emma, and he saw the determination in her eyes. She was right. The shadow was weakening. But just as Emma thought they were winning, the shadow let out a final, ear-splitting scream. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the walls seemed to close in. The shadow surged forward one last time, attempting to consume them whole. Ava's small voice pierced the air. "Mom, look." Emma turned her head, just in time to see Ava pointing at the center of the room. There, in the corner, a faint light began to glow. At first, it was small, just a flicker, but as the shadow writhed and struggled, the light grew stronger, brighter. It was coming from the diary that Emma had forgotten to close. The words on the pages had begun to glow, their ink shimmering like fireflies. Emma reached out, instinctively grasping the book and holding it up. The light grew even brighter, until it filled the entire room. The shadow shrieked in agony as the light engulfed it. The darkness began to burn away, retreating back into the corners of the basement, its form shriveling and vanishing as the light consumed it. The air, once heavy with fear, now felt lighter, clearer. And then in an instant it was gone. The basement was still again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The glow from the diary faded, and the temperature returned to normal. Emma and Mark stood frozen in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Ava clung to her mother's leg, her wide eyes scanning the room. Is it gone?" Emma nodded, her heart still racing. "It's gone, sweetie. We did it." Mark exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging in relief. "I don't know how, but we did it." They stood there for a few moments longer, just absorbing the silence, the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to sink in. The shadow that had haunted them, fed off their fear, and twisted their lives had been vanquished. But even in their victory, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had not truly been defeated. It had simply been banished, forced to retreat into the corners of their lives. For a brief moment, she wondered what might happen if it ever found a way back. But as she looked at Mark and Ava, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The fight wasn't over, but for now they had won. And that was enough. And that's the end of the story. Make sure to like and subscribe.